In 1665, death stalked the streets of London. The Great Plague killed 100,000 people, 1 in 3 of the city's inhabitants. We know something of the horror of that summer through the diaries and letters of the wealthy and the literate, men like Samuel Pepys, who kept a daily record of what he saw. But hidden in the archives of London's churches are other stories. Preserved within parish documents are the experiences of ordinary men and women who endured the worst catastrophe of their century. From these fragments, we can reconstruct the story of a single street and the people who lived in it. Cock and Key Alley, in the parish of St Dunstan in the west, was squeezed into one of the many dank and dismal yards between Fleet Street and the Thames. In a cramped courtyard behind a tavern, 30 poor families lived and worked.
If we try and sort of categorise the people in Cock and Key Alley, they're pretty low down the social scale, but they're not the scum. They're not the very base froth, as some contemporaries would have talked about. They're the sort of person who is just clinging, if you like, to the urban economy.
William Gurney was one of those just about clinging on. He ran the alley's pub and sold groceries as a sideline to support his wife Anne and their daughter. Like most children at the time, she too would have been expected to help in the family business. John Gale was a blacksmith. He had a second job as a parish fireman and was paid for maintaining an engine for the quenching of fire to support his wife and 4 children. Opposite him lived Thomas Birdwhistle, one of the parish scavengers, responsible for clearing away the filth in the streets. Widow Andrews fostered orphan and lame children. She was now looking after a foundling child abandoned in the street. The boy was named Lawrence Dunstan, after the parish. John Dudley, though poor enough himself, served as a collector of alms for those even poorer. He lived with his wife Dorothy and had taken on extra work as a parish constable to support his daughter, Martha. Until recently, William Penny had been one of those receiving the charity that Dudley collected. As a grave maker, he'd found it hard to keep all his children. Now he was able to rent 1 room with his wife and their 2 younger sons, Edward and John. The parish paid for his eldest son, Joseph, to be his apprentice. The senior church warden of St Dunstan in the west was Henry Dorset. He was the closest thing Cock and Key Alley had to a leader. But before his election as a church official, he'd been as poor as those he now looked after. He'd taken poor relief in hard times. Now his job was to run things. He raised taxes and donations, appointed the constables who kept order, and the rakers who kept the streets clean. And above all, he kept a detailed record of how every penny of parish money was spent. These accounts, written in Henry Dorset's own hand, are the basis for this film.
One has enormous respect for the church historians who actually compile the accounts that we use. You know, these are literate individuals. They're not always keen to have their job. They're nominated because they're literate. These are people who are looking after, if you like, the community's welfare, the material welfare. They're recording in meticulous detail. To many people, obviously, they're boring clerks recording, you know, how much a padlock cost and, you know, another shilling for the barbed wire that was keeping the fence together. But that's what life's made of, those little incremental sort of bits of data.
From these bald parish accounts, we can piece together the stories of the Gales, the Dudleys, and the Pennies. We can discover what happened to them, and to many others who left no other trace, when the Great Plague struck. Winter 1664. London was thriving. Immigration from the countryside had swelled London's population. It had trebled in size in 60 years and was now home to 500,000 people.
London was huge. I doubt if you could walk along, I was going to say the pavement, but of course there weren't any pavements. I doubt if you could push your way along the street. Everybody pushing and shoving and full of their own business. Londoners had a reputation of walking terribly fast and not giving way to anyone.
There were even more animals than people. Dirt was a fact of life. Although rakers worked hard to clear away the filth, the streets were like sewers. Disease was everywhere. One of the apothecaries in St Dunstan was Mr Drinkwater. He treated venereal disease with the moss from the skull of a dead man. Without antibiotics, even small injuries, from cuts to rotting teeth, could lead to infection and even death. People would put up with great pain in search of cures or preventatives. Mercury enemas were advised to balance the humours. But the most feared disease of all was plague.
I think plague is so particularly terrifying because it's so sudden. It strikes you almost unannounced. It's also frightening because it strikes everybody. It's agonizingly painful. And the image of the disease, which is after all called the Black Death, isn't it? Where it transforms the body. And anything which makes the human body appear revolting or ugly is particularly fearful.